Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for everyone's patience as we kind of woke up this morning. I'm Marty Stockton. I'm with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and my two teammates and colleagues are Ingrid Fish and Phil Namany. So the three of us are going to be facilitating this today. Phil, if you could go ahead and click on the next slide, that would be great. So we're going to jump into talking about the agenda and the meeting purpose and the discussion guidelines, and then we'll pause and take some time to do some introductions. So anyway, so the agenda for today, this is the second technical planning series meeting for the electric vehicle ready code project. So it's about a 90-minute meeting, so we're going to take some time to do a little bit of intro, meeting purpose, introductions. We're going to have a three-part presentation on a legislative overview, and specifically this is the state of Oregon legislative process that's occurring right now. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about best practices, some research that we've done, and then some very early thinking on some draft code concepts. And so we wanted to share that with you all today. And after each presentation or each item on the presentation, we'll take a pause and kind of get your feedback on it. And just know that this is an example of early consultation in a planning process. And so this is a really good time to help us shape the work moving forward. Then we'll just have some general Q&A and group discussion, and then moving on to next steps within the technical advisory planning series, as well as next steps for the project. So that's the overview for today. Phil, would you mind going to the next slide, please? Okay, so the meeting purpose for today is, again, just sharing information about very active legislation at the state that is affecting EV regulations statewide. We'll also share some best practices research, draft code concepts, and just really want to make sure that kind of all of us here have kind of the same shared understanding, and you know, there's always gaps that we have in our knowledge, and so again, just an opportunity to do some information sharing amongst all of us here. Okay, oh, and then review timeline. Next slide. So one thing that we like to do at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability with all of our kind of internal staff meetings, as well as meetings that are external, is to just go over some shared ground rules. And so I'm going to just read through these fairly quickly, but I just want to acknowledge that these are these are very important values to the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. So by going through them quickly does not mean that we don't really respect and value this kind of the shared values we have. So they are listen to understand, not to respond, wait, which stands for why am I talking? And for those that are a little shyer or more introverted, it's also why am I not talking if you have a point that needs to be raised. Assume good intentions, but attend to impact. Be willing to make mistakes and be forgiving of those who do. Allow for and appreciate disagreement of opinions, ideas, methods respectfully. Personal stories stay. Lessons can be shared. And then, you know, with any group, sometimes there is a group culture that is identified. And so, you know, sometimes it's important to make your own ground rule. I don't necessarily see that for today, but maybe others have thoughts as we move forward. Okay, we're going to move to the next slide, please. Okay, Ingrid.
Marty, should I do? Yeah, okay. So we're going to do a really quick round robin. If we're going to have people put their name and organization in the chat, and then we're going to go around and have each person just kind of talk about one thing that you're looking forward to this spring. So we'll just go fast on that. am looking for, so I'll start. I'm looking forward to getting my entire adult family vaccinated so that we can start hanging out with our friends again. Marty, do you want to go next?
Yes, gosh. I am looking forward to an opportunity to see my children play some sports, and so I have a daughter that's playing volleyball, and I'm just to see her play again is really exciting. So that's what I'm looking forward to. Do you want to?
Bill?
Sure. Phil Namany with Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and actually I'm probably looking forward to possibly participating in softball this year. We have a citywide team that I help organize, and we didn't get a chance to play last year, so hoping that'll happen this year.
Jacob, I see you next on my screen, so I'm going to call on you.
Hi, everybody. Jacob Sherm, Portland Bureau of Transportation. I'm looking forward to a lot of that stuff and getting my garden planted.
Sergio?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the gardening and also bonfires. Spring is a perfect time for bonfires because it's still chilly at night. So I will pass it to Eric.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Eric Huang with Fourth. I think I'm kind of looking forward to still be able to ski in spring around April time. It's sticky. It's not as, but it's pretty out there. So actually looking forward to doing that this weekend if possible.
Anthony?
Hey, I am Anthony They Them with Portland Tenants United, and I am looking forward to being able to go read in the park without having to worry about it being cold and rainy with some new books that I have just checked out of the library.
Sylvia?
Hi everyone, I'm Sylvia. I work with Hacienda CDC. I think I'm with Anthony. I'm also looking forward to reading when it's not like pouring rain, and getting my second vaccine soon. So,
Alice?
Hi, I'm Alice. This spring, I'm looking forward to riding my new bike that I got this past weekend.
Brian?
Good morning, Brian, and I'm looking forward to continuing to plan a vacation that we've not had for a while. So vacation planning is going to be high on the priority list in the spring here.
Knowledge?
Hello. I don't really have any plans for the spring, but it's cool listening to all of yours.
Amy?
Hi there. I'm also looking forward to planting. I was just thinking behind me, there's a whole bunch of plants I bought. I can't wait to get in pots to make the yard great.
Sarah?
I'm looking forward to just seeing my friends in person. Well, getting vaccinated and seeing all my friends in person without masks. That seems lovely.
Steve?
Hi, Steve Lockhart with MKE. I'm looking forward to having everybody back in our office, working together as opposed to remotely.
I have Jay Richmond. I don't know who that is. I'm going to go on to Robert. Robert, are you with us?
Yes. Hi. Sorry. I'm looking forward to riding the bus again.
Joanne?
Hi, Joanne Johnson. I am also looking forward to riding the bus and reading in the park. So I'll second and third those.
And Barry?
Hi, Barry Manning from BPS. Not going to be able to stay the whole time. Wanted to catch up with y'all. I'm looking forward to just blue sky and some sun.
Great. I think that's everyone. Did I miss anyone? If not, we're going to kind of move on and kind of get into the meat of the topic area. So next slide, Phil. So we're going to start with a brief overview of kind of what's happening right now in the legislative process with regards to EV ready. Next slide. So just a little bit of background and context as to kind of how the state building code works and the relationship between the state and the city on EV ready legislation, as well as other legislation with regards to the building code. Local jurisdictions in Oregon are not allowed to exceed the state building code unless there is legislation that specifically gives permission to local jurisdictions, or unless we apply for a local amendment. I'll get into this in a little bit more detail later, but the local amendment process is extremely long. It's resource intense, and we, in our opinion, think that it's designed to make it very difficult to get approved at the state level. So bottom line is state building code trumps the city, and it's pretty difficult to be have any requirements for builders that are more aggressive than the state building code. So that's a little bit of background context, and just a little. I think we touched on this at a previous meeting, but just a little bit of background on the current EV ready rule. There is an EV ready rule in place. That current rule is extremely weak, and it actually preempts us from being more aggressive. So the current rule is that 5%, this only applies to any new parking facilities that have over 50 spots. And for those that have over 50 spots, 5% of those parking spaces need to be plumbed with the electrical capacity and conduit to support level 2 charging. So this rule actually preempts us. We're not permitted to make any requirements for any parking lots with less than 50 spots due to this current rule. So that's kind of the world in which we're living right now. Right now, the state system is really designed to give local jurisdictions control over designating the number of parking spaces or bike parking spaces in a building, and we can technically designate some spots as EV ready. But in order for those spaces to support EVs, we need to have infrastructure. So we need to have electrical capacity and conduit connected to that space. Those requirements of electrical capacity and conduit are currently controlled by the State Building Code Division. They are responsible for maintaining fire, life, and safety standards. So that piece is linked to the state. So regardless of what legislators require in terms of EV ready regulations, the city and state really need to coordinate to implement those recommendations. So we can designate the amount of spots that are EV ready, but the state has to work to require the amount of electrical capacity to support those. And an analogy is kind of thinking about buildings and outlets. So the city has control over kind of designating the amount of outlets in a given building or room. But those outlets are pretty much useless unless they have electrical capacity to support those outlets. And so the building code really needs to, because they're concerned with fire, life, safety, they need to designate the amount of electrical capacity that's safe and that coordinates with those outlets. So that's just kind of an analogy and a way of thinking about the EV ready work and our relationship to the state. It's really important that we are on the same page and coordinating. Let's go to the next slide to really kind of dig into the legislation that is being proposed at this point. So HB 2180 is currently in the legislative process, and it increases the percentage of EV-ready parking spaces to 20% for newly constructed, privately owned commercial and multi-dwelling and mixed-use buildings with 5 or more residential units. So it's essentially saying that in these specific buildings, privately owned commercial, multi-dwelling, and mixed-use, that have over 5 units, 20% of the existing parking spots need to be plumbed with electrical capacity and conduit to support level 2 EV charging. This current legislation as it's written currently allows, we worked with our city attorney to insert some specific language that allows local jurisdictions to go above and beyond that 20% requirement. There's been some talk with some of the representative offices about taking that preemption, the non-preemption language out. As it currently stands, it's in there. The status of the bill is that it has passed through the House and was approved with that non-preemption language. So we're happy about that. But that language is still at risk. So the next step is that it goes to the Senate. It doesn't look like we'll know the outcome of this bill likely any sooner than June. I think it seems to be supported, well supported at this point. So we're hopeful that it will pass. If it doesn't pass, we're subject to that 50 spot parking current rule. So we really need it to pass to be able to do this work. HB 2180 does not include single family dwellings and townhomes. So that's something that this bill does not get at. There is another bill that could potentially get at those pieces, and I can talk a little bit more about that bill later in this meeting, but it's unlikely that bill faces a lot of barriers, and it's unlikely for that bill to pass. So I'm going to stop here and just see if there are any questions on kind of the relationship between the state and local codes, and or just generally the legislative process currently with regards to EV ready.
I have questions about House Bill 2180 specifically in terms of like bill language and stuff like that. Should I wait on those questions?
No, this is a good time to ask that, Anthony, and I hope I'm able to answer. Go ahead.
Cool, thank you. So I'm wondering, now that it's in Senate committee, what do you think is the potential for winning any significant further amendments to it at this point? And I may have some questions about specific changes.
Yeah, so we ideally would like it to include existing buildings, single family buildings, like units lower than 5. So we have had this conversation with our government relations representative, who's the main kind of contact person with the legislation as well as the representatives. And we've been discouraged from making any more amendments at this point. They're really worried that adding more pieces would make it less likely to pass at this point. There was talk about taking out that notwithstanding, so that's the non-preemption language that we really want to stay in there. There's been talk about that being taken out, so that would be an amendment. We're hoping that that doesn't happen, but it might. So what I'm saying is that anything can happen. Like there definitely can be changes within the Senate, but we've been discouraged not to make any significant changes because it may it might impact its ability to be able to be supported by Republicans and pass. Did you want to talk about specific pieces?
Yeah, I have several amendments that are, I guess not, amendments might not be the right word because I don't have specific language, but I have quite a few ideas about ways that the bill could be made stronger. A lot of those would be pretty significant changes to it though. mostly things regarding requirements around like disability accessibility for the EV ready parking spaces. I know is something that's been brought up in this group previously. Things about ensuring the affordability of the housing and ensuring fair rates for those spaces if landlords are charging for parking spaces. And I would be interested in having stronger requirements or stronger, like a stronger requirement floor in areas with less access to public transit. All those are pretty significant changes though. So from what you're saying, it sounds like there's not a lot of chance of those being made at this point. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I love all of those. I love all of those amendments, and we would love for all of that to be part of the legislation. The one about affordability and affordability of the actual charging within, those are not typically linked to code or legislation. So I'm not sure what the ability to do those things is within a particular legislation, but those are all things that we're very interested in trying to be creative about how we might have some kind of control over that. But yeah, I'm hoping that Phil caught all of those bullets, because those are definitely some things that we've discussed and absolutely agree with you that in an ideal world, we would love to see those things be part of this work.
Yeah, I'll post those in the chat, Phil.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid.
No problem. Any other questions or kind of thoughts or of discussion with regards to the legislation? Okay, hearing none. I think it's good to potentially, Marty, move on to best practices. Talk about your best practice research.
Oh wait, I have one more question if it's okay.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. You mentioned one other bill besides 2180, which I didn't catch. Which one was that?
I'll get into that in a little bit more, like further into this meeting, but it's the REACH code bill. And it's bill, I think it's 2398. Bill, Marty, do you guys remember what the number is?
Yes, it's 2398. House Bill 2398.
Okay, cool.
Which was focused on energy efficiency of mostly energy efficiency of single dwellings and townhomes. So it was kind of on the other side of the spectrum there. And within that,
it's 2398.
Within the energy efficiency, there was a REACH code that included provisions about EV charging for houses.
And I'll get into that more specifically a little later.
Okay, cool. So
the reason why I'm not highlighting that here is because it's unlikely to pass. But go ahead, what's the question?
Fair. Yeah. My question was if the city has a position on Senate Bill 314. That's the one that would, it's regarding utilities putting a fee on customers specifically for use of like transportation electrification and alternative fuel vehicle infrastructure.
We do. It's a little outside of the scope of the topic of this meeting, which is really focused on EV ready. So I can, Anthony, why don't you and I connect on that this week, and I can talk to you a little bit more about that offline, if that's okay.
I mean, sure.
Okay.
I think we have a couple more slides, Ingrid, on the legislative overview.
Do you want me to forward next slide?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Oh, there was a question section.
Yeah, I think we're on the best practices now.
Okay.
Unless people have specific questions about the state, the relationship between the state and local codes.
I'm happy to move on to best practices, but folks, feel free to jump in too. Phil, you can go to the next slide. Okay, great. So we just wanted to cover and this is going to be at a very high level, just some best practices research that has occurred in our Bureau over the past couple of years. And actually, Sarah Wright, who is with us, actually started some of the best practices work. And then Phil and I and Ingrid have kind of carried that on as other local jurisdictions continue to pop up with their EV ready code adoptions. So anyway, so starting at a high level, I would say that there are a number of states around the country that have had, whether it's in their state building code, like Oregon, or state energy codes, will have various regulations at kind of a high level. What is beautiful about other states other than Oregon is that these regulations set kind of the floor or the minimum requirements, and then local jurisdictions have the option of going above and beyond kind of what the local requirements. And so, you know, California is an example of that. And then I guess I would say that there's a little bit of jealousy right now that our team is experiencing of other states and just the hierarchy of kind of the state policy regulations and then kind of the local regulations. Just to give you an example, you know, California, multiple cities have their own local EV ready requirements because they have the ability to have local building code requirements. Same with Colorado. So those are kind of just some observations that we have. Going on to the next slide. So doing a quick scan, and I just want to thank Eric at our last meeting for flagging the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. Super helpful resource. They have a great table when they're kind of reviewing and constantly updating a table on their webpage that is calling out kind of the various jurisdictions that have EV ready, and specifically most of the time it's building code. That is the one thing, I guess, one critique or feedback that I would give for SWEEP is that the location of the code is actually really important to those of us that are regulating or creating code. And so most of the time the regulations are in a local building code. But then Seattle, for example, their regulations is in their land use code. And then other jurisdictions will have the EV ready regulations are actually in their energy code. So those are just some nuances. And so this is just this is kind of a snapshot of some of the research we've done. We've done quite a bit more, but it's not worth putting all of that on the slide. But just to give you a flavor of, you know, I would say a lot of jurisdictions have had EV ready code that has occurred, I would say, within like the last 10 years. And these are just some examples of kind of some of our local West Coast city neighbors. We just wanted to highlight kind of the areas that are important to us as city regulators, that we do tend to break down regulations for single family, multifamily, which is typically 5 units or more, and then your commercial uses. And so that's kind of how we kind of define regulations. Just noting that a lot of jurisdictions require, you know, 1 EV ready parking space per dwelling unit in single dwelling or single family. Once you get to multifamily, so again, this is the 5 units or more, you start seeing a little bit more variety. So, you know, on the lower end, you'll see, you know, like 5% of EV installed, which is actually, that's actually like a stronger requirement because the EV infrastructure is ready to go, versus 15% EV ready and then 40% EV capable. So that's the Boulder example. We really were impressed with Seattle. Seattle was kind of, I would say, as far as our best practices overviews, Seattle really stood out to us. And what we liked about it was that it had, for the multifamily, it had 100% of EV ready up to 6 spaces. And then once you got to, so you had 6 spaces that are EV ready. And once you get to 7 and more, so like, let's say you have 20 spaces, then the remainder has 20%. And what we're seeing in Portland, especially since we have most of our multifamily has no minimum parking requirements. You know, a lot of our development has been kind of 10 parking spaces or less. And so for us to do just a flat 20% wouldn't be as strong. And so what I liked about Seattle's, or what we liked about Seattle's, was that it was like 100% of 6 spaces, you know, have that EV ready. And then just moving on to commercial. So this would be, you know, your commercial, your retail, your office, employment type land uses. And you can kind of see there's a little bit of a range. You know, some have distinctions between EV installed versus EV ready versus EV capable. Some, you know, have, you know, it's right around kind of the 5, 10, 20%. So that's kind of what we're looking at. And then just noting that we did review kind of cities around the country. In Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Honolulu had some really good examples there. New York, and then again, California and Colorado, just so many cities within those states have EV ready regulations. And then also our Canadian neighbors to the north, Richmond and Vancouver, BC. So there's some really innovative work that's happening in Canada. And next slide, please.
And
yeah, go ahead.
I would just add that, you know, the range for what we're seeing is really between 5% and 100%, which is a big range. But many of these cities are staying like within 20%. LA is thinking about going up to 50%. Vancouver, BC is requiring 100%. Many of the cities that have kind of lower percentages are now working to up those percentages. So we'd really like to, you know, land someplace where we don't have to come back and do this code work, you know, in a year or two, that we're really kind of like future proofing with our code.
Thanks, Ingrid. Good point.
This is Robert. Could I make a point on something here?
Yeah, please.
Looking at the San Francisco one that I'm familiar with, just a couple of points of elaboration, because it isn't clear just from looking at the numbers. The 20% panel capacity was very intentionally put in to make it so that as EV sharing takes place, as there's the ability to split up the power to different charging spots, with that 20%, you can easily cover as many as 100% of the parking spaces, which then ties in with having raceway required to be put in by the builder to all of the 100% of spaces. So that in the future, you don't know necessarily which of the spaces are going to need it, or if it's in a condo where people have deeded parking spots, which people are going to ask to have that done. And so that gives you the flexibility for actually getting, without any kind of change, because the capacity is built in at the time of construction, to get other spaces to be made fully EV ready at any time.
I really like that, Robert. I think there's some equity components too that that type of approach is really good for. And what often happens is the first, people to get the spots are the early adopters who tend to, be higher income. And if you're putting Raceway to every spot, it just makes it much easier and less expensive down the road for folks that are often on the lower income side to also get access to that infrastructure.
All right. And then having enough panel capacity built in that it can handle all of those spaces.
So just moving on to this slide, we're not just interested in the number of parking spaces or the percentage of parking spaces, as well as like the level or the type of EV capable versus EV installed or EV ready. But just we're interested in looking at kind of what are the best practices around accessibility. And so I just wanted to flag that, in Denver, they've specifically called out that, where there is EV SC installed spaces or new EV ready, new accessibility parking are both provided, so that at least one accessible parking space shall be EV ready or EV SC installed. So just flagging that. Definitely, we're still looking at, what other jurisdictions are saying about accessibility, but that was just one example I wanted to share with you all today. And then also, just through our conversations with folks that live in, multifamily housing where there currently is EV charging available, just acknowledging that, just kind of what Robert and Ingrid alluded to, that some of those spaces are designated per a person that is opting to pay for that spot. And there's definitely some equity issues with that. And so I think other jurisdictions are very interested in either requiring that, one spot is an EV car share. And so that kind of gets to multiple users as opposed to one designated person that gets that, that benefit. There's also, looking at how to have a parking space that has a higher turnover requirement. And we do have an example actually in our own city code in the central city that requires certain parking spaces to be short term. And so those are some options that we're looking at just to allow greater access to this benefit. So I'm going to pause there and just see if there's any thoughts or questions on that. Or maybe any other examples. Yeah.
I was just going to say that, that's good news about that. There's an example of how we might limit and encourage EV infrastructure to be shared. And it gets a little bit at the, what Anthony brought up earlier.
Just wanted to flag something on the shared as it relates to parking. I was recently talking with a car share company who's kind of wanting to learn more about some of the options we have in our development code around car share as as a way to I think reduce parking requirements slightly. But I think the really interesting thing that I learned through that conversation, and this wasn't about EV car share to be clear, but it was just that I think from a regulatory perspective, we need to have a developer with an agreement on a dedicated car share spot at the time of application. Mm-hmm. And when I was talking to the car share company, they said, we don't want to be signing up for agreements 3 to 4 years in advance. We want to be doing these kind of agreements, right before occupancy, which shows a pretty big gap between kind of what the market's interested in and what we're kind of requiring. So I just wanted to flag that as you're thinking about potential requirements that might rely on private service providers.
That's a really good point, Jacob. And what I didn't get to on the last slide is that in Boston's example, it's very much tied to the Transportation Demand Management Program, which I love that. And I do think that that is absolutely a coordination opportunity between BPS and PBOT to think about car share requirements as a part of TDM and or development code. And then what I liked about Boston's example is that it was very, I would say, aggressively pointing to car share needs to be EV. So that was an interesting kind of additional element. So something for us to talk about. So again, just wanting to pause and allow folks to weigh in on any of the best practices we've shared, or if there's anything else that came up for you.
I have a kind of a clarifying question, kind of going maybe back to Ingrid's original kind of metaphor of like the building, and we can require the plugs, but it doesn't, but the building code is what makes sure the electricity kind of gets there. So kind of under our existing state framework, it sounds like we could potentially through local ordinance or zoning code say we want more than 5%, but then there's not building code to kind of back that up and actually make sure that a developer would have to put in more than the 5% minimum requirement. Is that correct?
Yeah. So if we were to get granted permission to be more aggressive than the state building code, it would be on our local inspectors and code folks to enforce whatever the standard is that we come up with. And it would need to be coordinated with the building code, because builders look to the building code for that information typically. And so there'd need to be some kind of crossover for communication.
But just to be clear, our city attorney has told us that we right now are preempted by going higher on the number of spaces. So we're locked in at that, parking spaces or parking lots that have 50 or more than have the 5%. So we are locked in at that. So what Ingrid is saying is that we would have to go through that local code amendment through the state process to get the authority to go higher, or we're kind of hanging our hat on hoping that the House Bill 2180 passes, so we can at least get 20%. so those are the kind of things that we're
and if HB 2180 passes as written currently with the notwithstanding non-preemption language, we would have the ability to go above and beyond.
Tammy, it looks like you have a question.
Hey folks, thanks. I'm going to leave my camera off because I'm having connectivity issues. Sorry about that. This is Tammy Boren-King. I do development review for PBOT, and I just wanted to throw it out there. There's a lot of really great ideas, and a lot of them present difficulty with implementation. And I just want to put it out there that within our existing systems, we're really good at implementing rules that make you build something, because building inspectors are allowed on site while the building process is happening. But we've traditionally had very little success enforcing regulations that are about behavior over time, such as requiring a parking space to be a carpool space or requiring something to be shared. So while the regulations have great intentions, without a mechanism to enforce them, they might not get us where we want to be. And so we may just have to have a little bit of check in with the powers that be to see if there really would be sort of the desire to fund an enforcement program, which, as we all know, is very, very difficult to get money for behavior over time, especially. Yeah.
Excellent point, Tammy. Excellent point. And, right now the default is the city relies on a complete complaint-driven process for enforcement, and there's some, there's significant equity issues
Right,
with that.
because
So,
you can get evicted if you complain, or the property owner doesn't necessarily have to allow the compliance officers access to their property. So if you have to get inside the garage to see how it's being used, that's difficult.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and this is also a point of contention with our, Bureau of Development Services, because they keep getting like more and more requirements piled on, and it becomes harder and harder to enforce. So I think there is a balance between, do we charge more for permitting and then fund the enforcement through those charges? We're already getting pushback from the building associations. They definitely don't. They're upset about being required to put in this infrastructure, and then putting a price, a high price for the permit on top of that is just hard for them to swallow too. So I think these are very real. The implementation pieces are sticky, and that we're definitely going to need to kind of dig into that more.
Well, why don't we move on to the next portion? So we wanted to just give you, on that note, we wanted to give kind of some more aspirational, like what we'd like to do. So, and this is where we're at. This is a draft, and so we're definitely looking for feedback from you all today on this. So best case scenario, if the House Bill 2180 passes and Portland has local authority to develop code, what we're wanting to do right now is that kind of going off of the Seattle example, we want to do 100% for, this is for multi-dwelling and mixed use development for new. 100 spots are EV ready for up to 6 spaces. And then after that, 50% of spots for parking lots with 7 or more spaces. And then the EV ready requirements would include electrical capacity, conduit to support level 2 charging for the number of spaces specified above. I just wanted to note that we heard some really good feedback earlier regarding the raceway, and so that's something that that's some good feedback today. For commercial, we, again, we saw kind of a range of 5 to 10 to 15%. We would like to do 20% of spots are EV ready for parking, conduit, and electrical capacity support level 2 chargers. And just acknowledging that when we pulled together kind of the initial stakeholder group, which many of you were part of with us on this journey last spring of 2020, and then are continuing on with us right now, that we were really focused on our priority, our equity priority, which is multi-dwelling housing. And so we kind of selected folks that are familiar and connected with that perspective. And so we're just acknowledging that commercial may include employment and industrial, and that our current stakeholders don't have those perspectives or experiences. And so that's something that we are aware of. At the same time, there may be state legislation that is moving forward. So we're just acknowledging that. Okay, next slide, please. So kind of continuing with the best case scenarios. Again, we're very much interested in exploring some EV requirements for either car share parking spaces that are EV ready, or parking spaces that require a user turnover. We've talked about this earlier today. One of the things that we are trying to do overall in this project is think about mitigation strategies to kind of really address not only putting in this requirement, but then how are we kind of upholding our equity goals for this project. And so wherever we are specifically doing something like that, we're kind of flagging it as a mitigation strategy. So that's why I have that language in there. And then On the single dwelling piece, just sharing that it is our understanding that we are currently and still will be preempted from requiring EV installation for single dwelling units in housing sites that have 1 to 4 units. So again, under that 5 unit or more. And the REACH code, which Ingrid will talk about. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Next slide.
Hey, Marty, just before the next slide, Phil, can you go back to that slide? Just one other thing that I think we'd want to add. So I think the feedback we got today about the 100% raceway requirement, I think like you mentioned, Marty, is something, but in addition to that, potentially adding something about like explicitly adding language about an ADA spot requirement. So that's another thing that I think we probably want to add to our draft code concept.
I think some of that, just to keep in mind, and I don't know if Terry's on board on the call or not, but there is, as we said earlier, a very close link between building code requirements and land use codes, and things like ADA parking and so on do get determined by the building code. And it may be a case where if somebody is only putting 1 or 2 parking spots on a site, they may, and we have a requirement for 100% EV requirement, it may just be by default that the ADA spot is a EV ready spot. So those are things that would probably be more at the building code scale rather than through the land use code.
And I absolutely had similar thoughts, and that's why I didn't put that as a bullet on this slide, because there is already that connection. But I think it's just really important that we make sure that any EV charging benefit is also accessible to all of our users, including those with accessibility needs. So we just want to be really sensitive to that. Okay, next slide.
Eric has a question.
Oh,
Eric, did you have a question?
Yeah, or more like a quick comment, if you don't mind going back up one slide. So basically my comment is related to the commercial buildings. I think multi-unit dwelling having more is definitely better. I have no concern on that. And I do think 20% of the capacity, electrical capacity being built in from HB 2180 is going to be a very good start. For commercial, I do think the 20% probably would be fine for office buildings kind of scenario, or just employment locations or industrial locations with fleet and stuff like that. But it might be a burden for retail locations if retail location happens to be in there. That's a comment I heard for HB 2180, and probably that's something that we need to pay attention to as well, because if it happens to be a gigantic lot and 20% of that's a lot, and it might just get very much underutilized, and there might be alternatives for maybe DC fast charging or a lower percentage as an alternative rather than 20%. So
we have had similar thoughts. The example that we've been using in-house is EV charging at a 7-Eleven parking lot, and just kind of thinking about that, and what is the duration that people typically spend at a 7-Eleven parking lot, and whether or not that makes sense. And so we're having those kind of pragmatic thoughts as well. So just moving on to implementation issues, just again, this is kind of a common theme of this presentation. So just again, we're very hopeful about House Bill 2180 becoming law, but just acknowledging that we as a city are still unclear about the implementation. And the example is that we really don't have precedent for how to incorporate EV ready requirements, specifically in the City of Portland's Title 24 building regulations or Title 26 electrical regulations that are more aggressive than the state building code. So that's a implementation issue that we're just flagging. Also, so even though that the House bill appears to give local jurisdictions a pathway to exceed building code, we're just not sure, again, about the authority in kind of the coordination between our city titles. So again, titles 24, 26, and then title 33, which is the planning and zoning. And planning and zoning code, or our land use code, is where we would want to do, again, the number of spots or the percentage of spots. And it's, but it's, again, tying it to the life safety requirements in titles 24 and 26. So there's like that, how do these regulations work together question. And then, you know, finally, just, you know, we're just really wanting to figure out how to be more aggressive in again, the integration with the building code. So those are all kind of conversations that have gone round and round in our offices. Okay, next slide.
Let me unmute myself here. Okay, so I'm going to get into a little bit of just talking about what that local amendment looks like. We said it was long and resource intense, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. So, and if we were to decide to do the local code amendment process, it involves like a heavy involvement from our city attorney's office, which is pretty resource intensive. Public hearings. There needs to be a report that includes a summary of all of our public hearings, an outline of the impacts of the local amendment, an explanation about how the municipality will respond to concerns raised during public input, an identification of financial and regulatory incentives provided by the municipality to businesses or contractors impacted by the local amendment request. And then, so that means like, if there are businesses that are going to object, which I'm sure the builders will, that we need to identify, like, are we going to provide them incentives? Are we going to, you know, give them some kind of financial buffer? This is something that wouldn't necessarily be required if we, you know, had legislation to allow us to do this. We'd also have to do a fiscal impact study, which means, you know, hiring consultants to kind of give us really specific estimates of what this might cost in different scenarios. And there's just a little bit of background about the last time we did this. It was prior to 2000, and Portland was not granted a local amendment. And then there's also a clause that basically says that the state has the right to terminate approval of local amendments at any time. So, you know, there's talk at the legislative process right now of like, oh, you know, Portland doesn't need that non-preemption language. They can just, you know, they can just apply for a local amendment waiver. It's actually like really unlikely for us to even get the local amendment approval. And if so, it can change without any reason. So it's definitely something that we don't really see the local amendment as a viable option. And then just kind of digging in a little bit deeper about the REACH code, which is also being considered in the legislative process. The REACH code is a code that is more environmentally aggressive than the state building code. It's currently voluntary and it includes EV ready provisions for single family, 2-unit and townhouses that have parking. And the REACH code would require conduit and electrical capacity to support level 2 charging in each of those units that have parking. But the HB 2398, which is the REACH code bill, would give local jurisdictions the ability to opt in and make the REACH code a local requirement. So currently it's voluntary. And what this bill would do is to give us the option to make it a requirement for builders. Apparently there's a lot of opposition to this bill. There's kind of like fiscal things that have been put on this bill. So right now it's going to Ways and Means. There was like a greenhouse gas report that was being required to go along with it, and they had 2 FTEs that would need to kind of implement this that was going along with it, and it was getting kind of a big price tag, and I think that was happening kind of on purpose to prevent it, to like cause barriers for this code. Northwest Natural is very much opposed to it. I think not because of the EV ready pieces, but more because of kind of like the electrical, heating, and other building pieces that are not related to EV ready. Home Builders Association, extremely opposed. And even if this does get passed, it's likely to take several years to figure out how to implement it. So it is something that's out there that may be useful, but it is kind of a long shot at this point. In addition to the REACH code, there's also, so these are kind of like contingency plans if HB 2180 doesn't pass. Governor Brown in 2017 issued an executive order which directed state agencies to require at least 1 level 2 charger for new construction projects that have parking. This is currently, there was a group at the state level that was working on this. It was called the BWIG. They've since stopped working on it. They really never focused on the EV ready piece. Mark Long, who was the Building Codes Division Director previously, was pretty against the EV ready piece, even though the governor had directed it. But the executive order has a deadline of October 1st, 2022. We're not really sure like how this piece fits in, but it is a way to be more aggressive than the current rule, and it's out there. So I think what the state staff is doing is waiting to see themselves whether or not HB 2180 is going to pass, and then potentially continuing with that governor executive order direction, depending on whether or not it passes. So, and then I mentioned before, just regardless of if HB 2180 passes or not, we will likely be working with partners to draft future legislation that has language to include requirements for single family dwellings, that has language to include requirement for existing buildings at some point, and to ensure that Portland is not preempted from requiring more aggressive EV ready requirements. So unfortunately, due to barriers at the state, we really see this work as a phased approach. And we're just hoping to get as much, to get as far as possible in the current legislative process, but we also understand that the work is going to continue and we're going to need to keep working on this for future sessions.
So if we could go to the next slide. We wanted to at least share with you all what we can do now. So, and it's maybe not as exciting as kind of what we aspire to do, but there are some really good, I would say, clarifications that we can do in the code right now. So just acknowledging that EV charging infrastructure and EV ready is happening voluntarily right now. Jacob and I were out on a city staff bike ride for another project, and was it 62nd, Jacob? We were biking down 62nd next to Brentwood Park, and noticed that there's a new development that had EV ready, and I took pictures of it on Friday. So EV ready is happening already voluntarily, and we just want to acknowledge that. Right now we have a city zoning code or land use code that is completely silent on these type of voluntary or market decisions that are happening. And so we do want to put in some development standards that talk about placement and signage for voluntary EV installations. We want to clarify EV ready installations and how they're categorized. And this is actually a request that the Bureau of Development Services has asked for us. They're kind of making interpretations on the spot, good interpretations, but they could use some help. And then we do have a city council directive to clarify or put into code what land use category a mobility hub is. And this is also in accordance with the transportation systems plan, new mobility policies, that this is again a PBOT and BPS coordination item. So continue on to the next slide with the theme of what we can do now. There's also a desire to put in some voluntary incentives. And so the two things that we've identified are that there could be floor area ratio, or this is the massing of a building, bonuses for EV ready installation and in structured parking. So right now in our mixed use zones, if a developer, instead of doing surface parking, does structured parking, then they get floor area ratio bonuses. So that's in the current code. And what we're saying is, well, structured parking is great, but you should have some EV installation to get that bonus. And so like that's a slight tweak to the code. Another thing that we could do is that in our non-conforming situations chapter, so if a site was developed years ago and they have different development standards that are now non-conforming because of new regulations that have been put in place, when a property owner is going in to do improvements to the site, they right now can get they can trigger non-conforming upgrades that the city requires them to improve the property. So what we're saying is that within that structure, if a developer or property owner is putting in EV infrastructure, that those costs would not be counted towards non-conforming upgrade thresholds. And so again, that is another, I would say, mitigation strategy or voluntary incentive that we could incorporate in the code today, regardless of what happens with House Bill 2180. Next slide. Okay. So again.
So Marty, I just want to clarify the non-conforming upgrade piece. So basically this would help builders in that, you know, if they decided to elect to do those the EV ready installations
voluntarily,
that it wouldn't necessarily trigger that they would have to do all these other conforming upgrades that we're requiring them to do, which, you know, would maybe be a reason why they would decide not to do the EV infrastructure. If people have questions on it, please let us know.
Tammy, please.
Hey, thanks, folks. So I'm one of those people who, you know, kind of helped implement those standards, the parking lot standards. And has there been any discussion of sort of granting automatic reductions to parking lot landscaping requirements in order to accommodate the charging stations? Because a lot of, you know, that doesn't matter for structured parking, but it does matter for a lot of our apartment complexes that have like surface parking spots.
I might let Phil weigh in on that, but this has definitely come up in our conversations about that. We are seeing voluntary EV charging go into landscaped areas, and you know that could be such that it has a developer actually not meeting landscape standard regulations. And so that is kind of like one of those clarifying questions that we have that we need to respond to in the code. I don't know, Phil, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Well, I think that was back to a couple slides ago where we talked about coming up with development standards for an EV charging station, and do we, you know, apply the same standards we would for other forms of mechanical equipment or not? And so that's something we haven't come up with a solution yet. And we've been discussing about, you know, is it okay if it's on an interior parking strip, but do we still want to have perimeter parking, landscaping? There's also a question about whether those EV charging stations if it's okay if they kind of infringe on the actual minimum parking space, which would be another potential place to put it, to actually place it in the corner of the parking space itself, and not, we have an 8.5 by 16 minimum space size. So could that be the case? So we're looking at those, but that's all kind of a part of the idea of applying or creating standards specific to these facilities.
Thank you.
Jacob?
In the world of creating standards, this is more an implementation comment or question, and zoning code might just be silent on it. But I guess I am kind of also thinking through where, if you set a requirement around EV readiness, what's the process for how the property owner, the HOA, the tenant figures out to say, let's take this ready spot and actually turn it into an EV installed spot? Are there standards that we want to kind of put out there for what that conversation should kind of look like? And I really don't know, but I'm just kind of thinking like, if a requirement was in place from a readiness, how do you actually turn that into a spot?
Yeah, so I think Eric actually on this call might be able to answer that, but it's not an easy thing. There are multiple steps for building owners to have to go through to figure out who a consultant would be and what that might look like and what the costs are for actually putting the charging in. But Eric is working on a project where they are actually putting together those steps. They're outlining those steps for building owners so that they can, it just gives more information about who those consultants might be, what the cost might be, what the different options are, and what the steps are. But it's not necessarily something that is related to the code at this point. As part of this project, we are also kind of putting together a parking lot, like these are issues that also probably need to be addressed to actually get to the outcome that we really want to see, which is more EV charging. Because what we're doing right now is laying a foundation to enable the EV charging, but there's another step that needs to be taken by building owners, and that is actually getting the chargers in there. And so you bring up a good point, and we have flagged that as kind of an area for future work as well. But Eric, if you want to add anything about the project you're working on, feel free.
Yeah, I think I've probably done this plug many times about my project, how there is this toolkit that we're hoping to create for everybody, especially stakeholders relevant to MUD charge, like residents who could be tenants or unit owners of condominiums, and also overall local government could use it as well. Local utility could use it just to inform or create their own versions of a guideline to help people go through this process of getting charging into MUD buildings. However, that is more concerned with existing buildings or building that has been developed and put into place. Where for today's conversation, I do think Inge has touched this already, is that we are mostly talking about how do we set up those requirements correctly for EV readiness that's going to facilitate next, which is going to help address a lot of the barriers that I am actually observing right now as I create this toolkit for existing MUD buildings that have electrical capacity restrictions or sites restrictions overall due to limited parking or limited capacity, or parking and power being very far away, creating all these barriers for themselves. And that is something that this bill could potentially, or this requirement is going to address a lot of them. And probably one thing that I just think of is that as we have this requirement and with the capacity of electrical capacity requirements in there, it's already going to remove the majority of the cost barriers for putting up charging stations in there. And it actually creates a lot more opportunity than ever before with that 20%, if not higher requirements in terms of electrical capacity, because the technology today is already capable of spreading those out throughout the entire building cost effectively, assuming there is conduits already in place or raceways already in place. Therefore, it's actually very important to get this first step done because it lays the best groundwork there is to facilitate what's the role for everybody to have a more universal access to charging. Because without the electrical capacity and that raceway already put in place during construction, it's going to be way more expensive, and people will have to rip off a lot more already done constructions, and that's just going to be non-cost effective down the road. And that's why this is important. Yep, thank you.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well, is that the majority of the complications and the costs are in this piece that we're trying to solve for, which is electrical capacity and conduit. Marty, do you want to go on to this?
Yeah, I was talking and it was mute.
Oh, I can have one more.
Please.
Thanks. Of the draft code concepts, I think one that stood out to me was definitely the part about car share or ride share spaces. I think that especially for a lot of lower income tenants who don't necessarily have as much ability to put money up front to buy a car, ride share or car sharing services will be pretty important to being able to access electric vehicles moving forward. And so I'm very interested in learning about ways to possibly incentivize including EV ready car share spaces or spaces that could be used for car share purposes in new developments.
Thank you. Well, let's move on to the, I think it's the next two slides. Well, no. So I'm just doing a quick time check. It's 11:20. The only thing that we want to go over is just next steps of the project and then next steps of this group, but we just wanted to pause and just see if there was just any general Q&A and discussion, and just take a few minutes for that if folks have anything that they want to bring up.
And I just want to go back to that, the goal of really increasing EV access to low income and multi-dwelling residents. Anthony brought up a good point about that sharing is a really important piece to that, just because of general affordability of these vehicles, although they are getting cheaper, and the used market is increasing. But just wanted to hear from this group whether or not there are other things that we should be thinking about in our draft code concepts, in addition to what we've kind of already laid out, that really will focus on that low-income multi-dwelling resident benefit space. Jacob?
Has there been any further discussion?
Oh, no.
Has there been any further discussion about utilizing on-street charging at all? Is that something that's been taken a look at or looked at?
Oh, I've got my hand raised. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, did you want to speak to that question, Jacob, or did you have something else?
Yeah, no, I was going to speak to that question. So, again,
Okay,
Jacob Sherman at the Portland Bureau of Transportation. We're currently scoping a project right now that's starting to look at public charging, which would include kind of right-of-way charging. I think we're working hand in hand with planning and sustainability kind of on this work, and I think are hopeful that pieces of state legislation like House Bill 2180 would pass so that we could focus on private development, but we're also starting to look at what charging in the public right-of-way would look like from kind of a minimum perspective around the city. And I'd be happy to share more information kind of about that project if you wanted to follow up.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
And Knowledge, we're also working with the utilities. I don't think there are any utilities on this call. to really try to ramp up more of the EV charging hubs, so that there's more public charging available, especially more fast charging available for people. And it can also be a solution for people who in multi-dwelling units who just want to be able to kind of get their car charged and then bring their car back to parking on the street. So I think there are multiple solutions to this problem, which is that people need access to charging, and the demographic that is hardest to reach to be able to give access are people in multifamily buildings and often low income and BIPOC communities. There isn't just a one bullet solution to this problem. It's not just in EV ready new construction. This is the piece that we're working on right now, but it has to be a multifaceted solution to that problem.
And the reason I asked is because the county is currently looking at how we can use our county facilities as a place where community can charge at a county facility if they live in one of those units, or if they're a low-income resident who can't get charging installed in their existing building. If we have the capacity to put charging on some of our buildings, especially in some of these lower income communities and some of our communities of color where we have buildings that have parking or have an area large enough that we can install some charging.
I think that work's really important. As we know, most people live in existing buildings. And this, the new construction requirements don't even touch that. It's just, buildings that are going to be built going forward. And oftentimes lower income folks tend to live in older existing buildings. So I think it's encouraging to hear that the county is also looking at solutions.
Well, and I'm actually really excited to hear that knowledge, and I think that deserves a follow-up conversation between you and the team here, or in Jacob too, because I think anytime kind of government can do these pilots or do these kind of creative ways to provide access, then it would be great for us to partner with you and kind of helping get the word out about that, because it's amazing kind of the waterfall effect of maybe encouraging other government entities to do something similar. So super exciting to hear about that today. Jacob, did you have a different topic to bring up?
Yeah, I did. I think I was just maybe kind of going back to the code concept in the scenario where House Bill 2180 passes. I think it was 100% of 6 spots being kind of EV ready, so not installed. Is that correct? I just wanted to make sure that I was clear on that. I think I would maybe then. Okay, thanks. I think I would maybe recommend.
Jacob, it would be the plug. So it would be the outlet would be there. There's several different ways of looking at things as EV ready. But we would like to see that the outlet was there so that all you needed to do is buy a charger and be able to plug it in.
Okay. I guess perhaps thinking from an equity perspective would maybe encourage thinking about going further towards that kind of the actual installation, recognizing that newer developments are probably going to be prioritizing kind of higher income individuals, but where those newer developments are also occurring in other parts throughout the city, I think, we know that some individuals will be kind of more successful at advocating with their property owners to make those improvements and make those investments. And in order to kind of provide greater access, it would be great to just kind of see us set up around installation of a certain number of ports or units. So it would just encourage you to think about that.
I had a quick question. I know it came up earlier about low-income residents. Is there any information about the percentage of low-income residents in the city of Portland who are moving into new construction buildings? And particularly how, like, what percentage of new buildings are low-income buildings?
I'm going to let one of the planners take that, but I mean, there are requirements for a certain amount of new buildings to have affordable units. So there's that. But yeah, Marty or Phil should probably speak to that.
Yeah, and I apologize. I don't have any concrete numbers to give today. I mean, I think that that's something that we could pretty easily do a data query on. You know, what Ingrid is referring to is that a couple of years ago, the city passed inclusionary housing requirements. And so when you have a new, you know, market rate housing development that builds 20 units or more, then you trigger inclusionary housing. So that is something that's going forward, and we could provide the numbers actually to you on that. And then additionally, and this is more of an anecdotal answer to your question, we were really excited to have, and Ingrid, you might want to jump in here, but there is a green building policy for our affordable housing developments. And so all affordable housing developments that receive dollars through the Portland Housing Bureau have EV requirements. And so last fall, we had coordinated with the Housing Bureau, and actually, I think it was at least 8 or 10 of their recent funded projects. So whether it's Reach Community Development or Human Solutions or Rose CDC, when they are receiving money from the city of Portland for that housing project and they have parking, they do have to put in EV charging. And so that was, anyway, super exciting to see that that's happening already. And I'm going to pause there and see if any of my other colleagues want to jump in on that question.
Yeah, I can get into more detail about that.
And I just want to add, I believe this.
Oh,
I was just going to mention, I think the Housing Bureau is going to be releasing a state of housing report in the near future. And so there may be some additional information they have on that. But keep in mind that the inclusionary housing requirement only applies to buildings with 20 or more units. And they also have to provide parking. So we do have a lot of both market rate and affordable housing projects that may not be providing any parking, especially if they're a little on the smaller side. So there's always that aspect of it. You know, there has to be a parking lot or structured parking associated with it to be able to get the EV charging. And like Ingrid said, I think Alice had her hand raised.
Yeah, let's go to Alice because we're running out of time here. I think we're 2 minutes over. So go ahead, Alice.
Okay, yeah, I'll make this quick. But just one thing that has not really been brought up is like the actual practice of using these charging stations. So for example, I'm a renter with an EV, and in my building, you have to pay for the spot for the month, and whatever charging you used is in that rental. So the spot is $180 a month and you can charge your car as much as you want, but you're the only person that can use that spot. Now I've been to other buildings where they have EV charging available and you just pay for the charger as you use it, but you can't like always park your car there. So if we're looking at like ways to make this like affordable, I think that having electricity that you pay for, like if I went to like Target and use their charging station, like the user actually just pays for it in that rather than having, because if you have 6 spots in a lot, that's great. But if they're rented for the month and only 6 people can use them, it's not really helping. So I think just having that in mind too, well, like, yeah, having these chargers is great, but then you're giving the landlords a lot of discretion on like how they actually build those, and so like how they'll be utilized. And I think like having people pay just for usage is just a way to incentivize this like sharing affordability. And then there also has to be a way that like landlords can make money that way rather than just having the spot rented. So just from my experience, that is a big deal.
Yeah. That's a really important point. And it is something that we keep thinking about. The code's limited as to how we can regulate behavior and how these things are used after they're installed. Marty, do you want to comment at all? Okay.
No,
it's something that we are aware of and that we're trying to actively come up with innovative and creative solutions to be able to have some kind of control via code or other tools to be able to encourage or require building owners to make those spots shared as much as possible.
And whether it's in the code, which we're a little shaky on, whether or not we have the ability to kind of address user experiences through code, there's still the transportation demand management program, which is where I feel like there's coordination and we can bring kind of the lessons from this project into coordinating with our PBOT staff on that. I'm going to move us on. We're over time, and I just want to get to next steps really quickly so we know kind of what's in our journey together, what's coming up. So as far as this technical advisory planning series, we do have two final meetings. We have a meeting that we've scheduled, and we'll get out the calendar invites for these, but we have a meeting scheduled for May 25th, which will be our third meeting. We'll review and discuss an updated code concept. And then our fourth and final meeting is June 29th, which we will give a update of the outcome of the state legislation. And at that time, we hope to come back with a very, very early kind of internal draft and preview of the discussion draft for your feedback. And so that's where we're at there. And then the final slide on next steps. You could move, yep. So this right here is kind of our overall timeline. And just to show you, the dates in the red are where we've had some timeline changes based on the state legislation and kind of the barriers that we've shared today. And so on a macro level, we're looking at kind of a 3 to 4 month kind of push out of our various phases. And this is, of course, there's still a lot of possible adaptation and flexibility that's needed in this timeline, but just wanted to share that, you know, it's still our hope that we take some sort of code package through the legislative process, you know, public review, hearings before the Planning and Sustainability Commission and hearings before City Council to get us with at least some sort of baseline for EV ready regulations in spring of next year. So that's kind of what we're looking at. And we'll keep sharing this as things change as well. And that's it. We have one more slide, and it's just, Ingrid, if you want to close us out here.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. I thought it was a really fruitful discussion, and I just have, you know, great notes about things that we can add to our draft code concept, and also just kind of like higher level issues that we want and need to keep in mind when we're doing this work to try to get to kind of our final outcome, which is to provide, you know, green, clean, alternative transportation option for, you know, low-income people and BIPOC as well as others. So thank you guys so much for your time, and sorry we went over a little bit. Anthony, if you want to email me about the Senate bill that you'd like to discuss, I would love to chat with you about that.
Will do. I'll be emailing you in a sec.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey, Marty, before you leave, so I didn't get a chance to look at the chat, but I know there was a way, isn't there a way of wording that before we all hang up?
Yeah, let's stop recording, and I'll see if I can